This is E&P Audio, a service of Editor and Publisher Magazine. Since 1884, the authoritative voice of news publishing.
Welcome back for the 6th episode of E&P Reports, the official podcast from the staff of Editor and Publisher Magazine. I'm your host, Bob Andelman. This week, we mix things up with two very different subject interviews. One on news design, the other on narrative news podcasting, and both offering tips on excellence in news publishing. First up is legendary newspaper and magazine designer Roger Black, who talks about design as a competitive weapon. Fun fact, Black designed the current logo for Editor and Publisher Magazine roughly 20 years ago. Now, after Black, stick around for behind-the-scenes conversation that Editor and Publisher Editor-in-Chief Nu Yang conducted with Davin Coburn, executive producer of audio for McClatchy newspapers. Coburn worked with Charlotte Observer reporter Scott Fowler on Carruth, a narrative podcast about former NFL star Ray Carruth, his girlfriend Cherika Adams, who was shot 4 times by a hitman, and their unborn son, Chancellor Lee. The narrative podcast they produced won this year's EPPY Award for Best Podcast with more than 1 million unique visitors. But right now, if you're thinking about redesigning your print or online product, my conversation with Roger Black will save you thousands on an initial consultation fee. And tell him E&P sent you. Roger Black, welcome to E&P Reports.
Thank you.
Roger, it's been a brutal time to be in the news business. That's no secret. What do you say to an editor or publisher who says, we can no longer afford to spend money on design? Hell, we can barely keep the presses running.
Well, I understand their angst there. It's kind of the ice cube in the parking lot. It's slowly melting away. And it's almost 25 years since the commercial web started. And it's in that whole time, we haven't figured out a digital news business model. There is just a couple of titles like the New York Times that have switched to subscriptions and seem to be doing great. But very few newspapers or news organizations are at that scale or that level. And others have made a lot of bad choices and find themselves in very reduced circumstances. Unless they were lucky enough to have a new buyer like the Washington Post and the LA Times, who has a lot of resources and wants to have a news organization that's really thriving. And so, however, to answer the question, I would say you can't afford not to have good design. And there are all kinds of reasons for it. But if we take a look at what's happened over this 24 years since the web started, we see a change in behavior of the news readers. The newspapers business we know about. But what I think the designers are trying to deal with is the habits, the way that readers go about absorbing news. And that's completely changed in this time. And in 1996, a fellow named Richard Gingras, who you probably know is the editor of Google News, was the editor of At Home Network, which was a cable, it was a cooperative effort started by John Malone and John Doerr to give broadband service to cable companies for their customers. And it was the first, very quickly after the web opened up, they introduced video streaming and, fairly good bandwidth. That company didn't make it for a number of reasons. But Gingras was already thinking about what these changes were going to make. And I remember him saying to me in 1996, you got to understand, Roger, that it's no longer the editor or the art director calling the shots on the way a publication is absorbed. It's the user the power is moved to the user. And I thought he was like, some kind of, 1960s hippie communist saying that. And it sounded like, oh, yeah, right. Power to the people. But in fact, he was completely right. And that's the hardest thing for us to actually handle as old-time news people. The idea that we're not sitting there handing out all this great stuff and they're lapping it up. It's more like they just dive in whenever they want to whatever they feel like it, perhaps even in a random way. You don't know where they're coming in from, Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, or some other link that they see, and they get to one story, which they may or may not read any of. And then, of course, we produce all of these hideous ads and things to try to push them away. And then they are pushed away. They're not even sure where they saw that. There's no kind of understanding of what the real meaning was, or whether there was any real provenance or accuracy, reliability to the story, anything. And then they're gone. And so our session times are cut into seconds. The idea that somebody would sit down at breakfast and spend 25 minutes with the newspaper is largely gone. There are people my age who still do that, but most people don't. And I find 80% of my reading is done online too. So what do we do? And I think that is the question right now. How do we deal with this new behavior? It is not the usual edition where you put out a newspaper in the morning and everybody picks it up, reads through it as much as they can or want, and then they say, okay, I'm done. And they close it up, put it away, and they go about their day. No one's ever done anymore. There's no feeling of completion, or that they've gotten through, or they have any kind of sense that, oh, this is pretty good report today. I learned a lot, or I love that column, or whatever. We don't have that feeling anymore. So I think that we have to deal with this, or we're not going to survive at all. And that really comes down to design.
Well, you bring up something that I think we don't talk about very much, and I want to come back to the general question in a second. But because of the way the web operates with newspapers, someone on Facebook could see a link to a story in the Des Moines Register today, and they're not in Iowa. They're in New Jersey or they're in London, but a story captures their eye and they go, oh, I want to click on that. And they wind up at the Des Moines Register and they're reading the story. Let's say they're actually reading the story. So what can the Des Moines Register do? I'm just using them as an example. I don't know what their website looks like, but suddenly they have the opportunity to capture a viewer that they would never have gotten in print. What do they? What is the paper in Montana or somewhere else? What do they do once they capture that person? How can design work to keep that reader on their site or move them along to something else? Is that possible?
Sure it is. However, there's sort of two things going on here. One is if it is truly random and they just happen to be enjoying one piece, it may not be an area that they're really curious about. To give you an example, I'm looking for data about the oil price right now because of what's going on in Saudi Arabia or what happened. And I end up at the Hearst paper, the Midland Reporter-Telegram. It turns out they have a really good data package about oil field production, spot prices, and pipeline flows, rig counts, all these interesting data things, which are usually something that you only find in the proprietary oil business. We
should point out that paper is in Texas.
Yeah, Midland, Texas, right. And Hearst also owns the Midland, Michigan paper, so one could get confused. Okay, but Midland, Texas is an oil boomtown, and you do see links to that paper every now and then. But in a case where you've captured a reader where you actually have some expertise, it could be the local college football team that's having a great year. It could be a business thing like that, or it could be some other activities going on in your town, maybe a church or something going in the schools that's different. that's interesting. And if you are covering that well, you have an opportunity of getting a reader. If that's the case, then you really have to find a way of moving them through and then trying to get them to subscribe, trying to get their address and trying maybe even to get a little money out of them. And that's something you can do with design.
Okay, so let's go into that for a second. What are the elements that paper should focus on design-wise when they bring that person to their site, and what do they not need to worry about so much? Because obviously their budgets are tight, their time is tight, but they do have the opportunity to bring someone in the Midland, Texas paper, for example. You went there for oil information, gas prices. What are the things that they should be focused on to keep your eye, to keep your attention, and keep you moving through their site rather than to lose you quickly? And what do they not need to worry about in that situation?
Okay, I think that to answer your second part, what they don't need to worry about is the tiny spot revenue they can get from incremental advertising on that page. Particularly the hideous clickbait ads that people put at the bottom to Outbrain or whatever that are masquerading as links within the site, but take you to these pages where each story is like got one page and then it's got 10 pages and you have to keep clicking to get another ad, and it's just a complete horrible mess. And it's also kind of shocking what the algorithms think that the user is interested in. And so sometimes it's a little disturbing. There's stuff in there that you didn't want to see. And that's nuts to do that. I cannot believe that very big time newspapers, and I won't name any of my clients' names or anything, but there are big papers that do this. And I can't believe the money is worth it because what it does is it devalues the experience. It hurts your brand. What you really want to do instead is make sure there's an unfettered, uninterrupted experience of getting information about what there are. Clear channel of text, good type, some kind of differentiation of the text, some way segmentation or subtitles or lists of points and things like that. And then easy links to sidebars that are related pieces so that you can go on and see stuff that they've done that are on the same subject. Not to take you off the site, though, something within the site. Then you want to have an easy way to get to the next story. This is something that many papers understand to do in their app. You can, like most apps, you can swipe from one story to another and stay within the publication. But very often on the web, they forget to do that because they're trying to do all this other garbage advertising. There is no obvious next story button. It doesn't swipe typically, and you can make it do that. Or you can put a little arrow there. There are a lot of things you can do. And that would help create the addition. Now I'm not saying eliminate advertising. I think that the key advertising, the top advertising should stay. It's going to add revenue, and people are actually interested in advertising. It's something that many editors always forget about. So what you do, though, if you can get people to go to the next story, you do get another impression for an ad, and they might continue on. You get a little mini edition. You get it in a sense, and maybe this is only going to last a minute or a couple of minutes. We're not asking for their whole breakfast time, but if you can get somebody to enjoy your publication for a few minutes, then there's a chance they'll come back, and there's a chance that they might subscribe. And we need a lot of people to do that to make that work. Mm-hmm. But right now, I think we're not compelling them enough. If anything, we push them away. We imagine they're not there to stay. And so that's reinforcing the behavior that's hurting us.
You had indicated to me earlier, before we started recording, that you've keyed in on two major points that you think every media effort needs, and that's identity and experience. Can you talk a little about each of those? Sure.
I think it's interesting because and very often you'll get a request to, what are your top 5 points, or what are your 10 take homes, and it's kind of the TED conference thing, or you do it at all conferences, and people like it. I mean, if you put a slide up like that, they always take a picture of it. but my feeling is that 5 is probably too many for most of us, so I've cut that back to 2, and the identity is really about what I do, the design. In fact, both of these are design things, but identity is the key right now in newspapers or news sites, news publications, because of this user behavior where everyone's just bouncing around, following the hypertext links, to the end of the earth and not paying much attention. When you do arrive, say I get to the Midland Reporter Telegram, if it really looks good, if it's easy to read, and it has that kind of handsome quality and has interesting pictures. I mean, I can't tell you how many really reasonably good newspapers, I won't mention any local ones, have terrible pictures on their site. It's like, why all these police blotter pictures? I mean, please, could we not have? I mean, there is really good photojournalism out there, probably more now than we've ever had. And you go to some sites like the Washington Post, and the photographs are amazing. The New York Times, which used to be a nearly blind man's newspaper in the sense that there was nothing, you didn't really need any. They didn't have pictures. Right. Now is filled with great pictures. So. That's part of it. The dress of the page, the typography, and the layout are very, very important. But you also want to make them special. You want to get, if you get to the page and it's the same font as everybody else on the web is using, which is essentially Georgia, then you're making a mistake. And most people do. They think that the download time is not acceptable if they add another font, yada yada. But there are great methods of working around that now with variable fonts, where the new technology on fonts, that we can decrease the download time and get a very rich typographical display that's very useful for readers and for editors. And that's what we need. That creates identity. It creates that special look and feel that makes you different. That makes you stand out from everybody else. And I think that's absolutely essential now. If we're talking about creating that edition experience, the idea that you want to come back or go or stay longer, it has to look special. If you're just there, we learned something in 2016 with the all the fake news stuff that happened, partly coming in from Russia, and how come people believed that fake news? Well, my feeling is that it was the layout. They used very generic. I won't mention any brand names, but they picked up templates from various web services, and they're quite nicely designed ones, and they were able to create pages that look exactly like typical news pages in the United States, and they were believable. That's generic, though. I don't think that a regular reader of the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, or particularly the Financial Times, which even colors the background of the page so it looks pink. I mean, that's brilliant. That way you get to an FT page and say, oh, I'm at the FT. And when you get to the New York Times and you see that Cheltenham font, you sort of know where you are if you're a regular reader. And that's what that identity is key. Of course, it doesn't mean as much to strangers. But if you're building some community, if you're building some loyalty, that's what you want, and you want to have that recognition when they come back.
That's
and the other one.
Yeah. Before you go to experience, I was going to say, as soon as you said that, I thought, anytime I go to the New York Times page or the Washington Post, I know where I am. There's no doubt that you are at a different newspaper, whereas. And again, we don't want to embarrass smaller papers because they have more limited resources, but a lot of them look like every other page in terms of not just if they're using Georgia, but if they have the same layout. They all have the same layout, and the layout. A lot of them they don't work. They don't really take you to the meat of what they have to offer, but it's cheap and it's efficient. But you go to that New York Times page, you go to that Washington Post page, and I'm going to guess the LA Times page as well, although I haven't spent much time there, it's probably the same kind of thing. So yeah, I just wanted to agree with you about that. So I think go ahead.
Well, that reminds me of something we used to call in the print era. It's funny when people ask me about newspaper design. I said, "Yeah, we had a great run in the 20th century," and I guess I had a pretty good run. Is good. I mean, not at the level of say Mario Garcia, but I did a lot of newspapers. And one of the things that we talked about, I think Lou Silverstein, the famous New York Times art director, explained this to me. Is called the gutter test. So, okay, you're in New York City, and in the old days, I was there in the 80s. There were still, I guess, 5 or 7 newspapers, and you had the Journal American stuff. I guess that's really the 60s, but you had a bunch of different papers, the Post, and you would be walking down the street, and there would be a scrap of newspaper in the gutter. And you look down at it and you would say, New York Post. you would just know. And it was like maybe just a dirty piece of, just about a 3x5 card size clipping. And you would say, Times. Oh, Herald Tribune. Because they all had distinct typography. And that's a funny kind of branding, but try that on the web. And we've seen this for years where people were at the S&D, people have taken screen grabs of 5 different publications and taken the logos off and asked you which one it was. And no one could tell. And that's not right. That's not right. I think that you need, one of the phrases I use is shark bait. You really need to kind of push it. You can't just make it nice. You have to really add flavor. A chef knows this. If you're going to make your restaurant different than the other restaurants, make people want to come back, it has to be different. It has to be good. It has to be great, but it has to be, it can't be just the same stuff. And I think that gets to building the experience that, this is really what design and good editing is all about. And we've sort of forgotten that. And, no offense to the podcasters of the world, but there's so much sort of individual blogging going on and individual voices that we don't really think about how in the digital era we can recreate that experience of a whole publication. And why do we want to do that? Well, one of the things is, going back to the swiping from story to story, if you go through 4 or 5 or 10 ads, you may not be interested in all those stories, and you may not be interested in all those ads, but one of those ads will work for you. And this is the same thing that happened in print. People were willing to put ads in the newspaper because they knew that they might not be seen by everybody, and they knew that not everybody was interested in their product. But they had a good chance that people would just page through. They'd paid for the paper, and so they were going to take a look. And magazines even more so. The New Yorker never had a great amount of art, but people went through every page of it because they, came every week. And so there are cartoons. This was helpful to get people to turn pages. And by the 1980s, the New Yorker was had the highest number of ad pages of any weekly. It was a hugely successful publication. And that's what we need to get that. We need to get that swipe thing happening. Have people stay in the publication so that we can sell ads. I mean, hey, get a grip. So what does that mean, though, also in terms of getting loyalty? And if you get someone to understand, if they get the brand, they understand the identity, and they know you. And, of course, this is not just design. We're talking about the voice and personality of the writing. One of the things that papers really miss on in the design steps is differentiating the different kinds of content they have, so that a live blog might look the same as a very reasoned news analysis. A news analysis might look the same as an editorial or a column. And you really want all those things to have different looks. You want to be able to say, this is just this is off the top of the head stuff that someone's just writing as it happens. And what is happening instead is that we're getting confused. we don't necessarily know what's off the top of the head and what's, some famous, Paul Krugman or somebody giving the big thoughts. So that's very important. So you create that experience, and now this means that the editors and their journalists have to be, they have to have complete integrity. They have to be completely honest. They have to, every time you knock on them, it seems like, oh, they really try. The New York Times, we used to say, well, if we don't know everything, let's list the things we don't know so that people know that we're not like just filling in the blanks, that in fact, there are unanswered questions here. And that's what good journalism does. And once you get used to that, you trust it, you believe it. And the same is true with the layout. If you understand, oh, this is opinion, this is first person, I don't agree with this, but it's an interesting thing to think about. Whereas if it's breaking news, if it's or news and analysis, you can tell, oh, they're really doing some work here. Someone's been out, someone's reporting. This is not just somebody on MSNBC talking about everything. It's actual journalism. And that's, once you get that going and people understand that that's an interesting experience and I want to stay there, then they trust you. And then you can start getting subscribers. That's where loyalty happens. So identity and experience together create loyalty.
Roger, is it too late for print in terms of design as a competitive weapon? You talked about, the 20th century was a great time for print, obviously. The 21st century, everything is sort of moving online. Is it too late to encourage publishers and editors to go back and reconsider design there, or should they put all their energy and their budget into their online product for design?
I don't think it's too late at all. I think I'll hold up my current print project, which is Type Magazine, which comes out, as the old Monocle magazine used to say, as international conditions warrant. I think we're getting 3 out this year, but it's not exactly on a regular basis. But it's a nonprofit. It's really focused on a narrow subject, but it's doing very well. It's fine. And why is that? Well, people like turning the pages. They like something that they can hold in their hand. They like something that has a feeling of craft. It's like, why is letterpress printing still alive? People love the touch. They like the legibility of it. And I think the same thing with all the art world, all of the crafts like pottery and stuff, handmade furniture. All that stuff is thriving right now. Now, maybe it's not, you still get a lot of your pieces from IKEA, but it's nice to have that beautiful vase that was hand blown that you picked up at a swap meet or something. That's, people are looking for that stuff, and I think print fits into that. Maybe that's maybe too diminutive, but it's not going to be it's not mass media. The print mass media, the print newspaper mass media era was really I would say 1895 to 1929. At that point, radio had taken over. And so print's hegemony has been over for nearly 100 years now. So get over it. Relax. Go on to other stuff. What is wonderful about print, and I think the New York Times understands this beautifully. And another on the magazine side, Bloomberg Business Week. How do you make something that's really interesting looking, that you want to hold, it's worth having? And the Times circulation, the print circulation isn't performing the way it once did in terms of being regional news for the New York metro area, but it's a international publication that comes out same day in Hong Kong or Tokyo or Frankfurt or wherever. It looks the same everywhere. It has that wonderful New York Times feeling, and you turn those pages. It was interesting. I read when I travel. I don't really imagine that I'm getting newspapers everywhere, so I always read online, and mostly just on the phone. But it's so great to last Saturday or 2 Saturdays ago, I was in Tokyo, and they had the weekend FT in the lounge at the hotel, and what a great product that is. And it had the How to Spend It magazine and the incredible reviews and great writing and some long reads. And what a great product that is. Now, you can get all of that online. You can get most of it online even earlier than it's in print, but it's not the same. It's not the same experience, a different experience. And I think if, those of us who want to succeed will do both. Mm-hmm. The New York Times or the Washington Post put a paper in everyone's hands to create a certain accessibility. It's wonderful on the bus or in the subway, where you don't have very, very reliable connectivity. But also it's just a nice thing to have. At the same time, it reinforces the loyalty. I mean, how many times do you, like the drone strike in Saudi Arabia? Okay, how bad is it really? The paper is already 12 hours old, and you go back to their online to find the update. So I think that you find loyal customers in all the media, mm-hmm. and you want to use everything. You want some kind of social outreach and Instagram and everything, and you want podcasts and you want video, and now they're trying VR and everything else they can think of. So yes, of course, if you can stretch as far as you can and bring people in every possible way, it's going to be better. And print is part of it.
All right, as we kind of wind down, let me ask you a couple of quick things unrelated to each other, but just to throw out at you. Young people still interested in design, do you encourage them these days to go into the news design business? And I want to say E&P now defines news as everything. It's not just newspapers. We're covering websites. We're covering MSNBC and CNBC, CNN, things like that. But would you encourage a young person who has always been interested in news design to go to newspapers or these news websites, or would their talents be better spent going, to Intel or Facebook or somewhere else? What kind of advice do you offer these days?
Well, I think you're going to, as a graphic designer, you're going to have more rewarding experience working with a content business than you are with what is essentially a tech business or a kind of distribution business or social media. There's not much design at Facebook. They don't even design their ads. They of course, I'm sure any Facebook person listening to this will say, that's not true. But come on, Twitter, please. The fact is, they could add more design. They could add more fonts, but they haven't. And I think that the two things I would say about content media may not be, newspapers as we've known them in the past, but that doesn't mean it won't exist, and that doesn't mean there won't be a demand for it. If anything, as conditions like the demonstrations we had recently about global warming, or the elections heating up a year away, that is stuff that people really want to know about. And I think that news journalism in some form will be very, very important. Design is a key aid for that, a key component. And what I would recommend for a young designer is get the history right. No newspaper history is fascinating, but also know typography and and the history of photojournalism as well, and that way you have some bedrock to work with. The basic letter forms in either Latin typography or Chinese have not changed in thousands of years. We're dealing with the same code. Learn the code, and that doesn't mean and that means you also have to learn the code. You have to learn at least. Some high-level code like Python, but the more coding you can do in your design effort, the better off you'll be. The combination of knowing parametric design code and web design as well as history, it will assure you get a job if you work hard and have a little talent.
All right. Finally, you held up a copy of Type magazine, which for our people who are only listening to the podcast, they can see it on the site. But I wanted to give you a minute to plug and promote the magazine. Tell folks who Type is for and where they can find it and how.
Oh, thanks. Well, Type magazine is a nonprofit. It kind of sprung out of a conference that I helped start called Typographics. And we realized that there could be a regular publication in the field, not so much necessarily just about type design, but that's getting very interesting. But the way type is used in all kinds of things, in publications or books, but also in outdoor signage and wayfindings, inscriptions, everything, all the kinds of letter forms, fonts, and type that you have. And it turns out that there's a groundswell of interest in typography, and we've kind of hit that a little bit. So we put out in a regular issue a variety of stories about what typography, what great typographers are doing, calligraphers, and also some of the historical stories, some specific case studies of a new typeface. It's a broad range, and it's kind of classic magazine. It has the front of the book and the back of the book. We put up in this issue, we have Matthew Carter on the cover, who's probably the most famous Latin type designer, that is Western type designer. And you can find out more about that at typemag.org. And I don't know if it's in time for this show, but we're doing a conference in Chicago in October, and we're planning to do regular local conferences at least once a year, as well as the magazine. So the website is at typemag.org.
Great. And where can people find you? Are you in? Is it rogerblack.com? Is that your site?
Well, actually, yeah, or typemag.org or typenetwork.com, which is where I make my money.
Right. And
Type Network is a representative of 25 great type foundries, including Font Bureau, which I helped start in 30 years ago.
Wow. And are you on social media, Facebook, Twitter, any of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, at Roger Black. My Instagram account is kind of lame, so let's not go there.
Okay. Of course, now that you brought it up, everyone's going to want to see it, so you may want to fix that.
It's one of those things like, I got to get to that. Everyone's doing that.
I understand. Well, Roger, we've known each other for a while. I should point out that we are both in the St. Petersburg, Tampa Bay area, because we like to identify where our guests are coming from. And always a pleasure to see you. We have to get lunch soon, and thank you for joining us on E&P Reports today.
I enjoy thinking about this. Thank you. Great to see you, too.
Next up, E&P Editor-in-Chief Nu Yang kicks off the first in a series of interviews with winners of the 2019 EPPY Awards, presented annually by Editor and Publisher magazine. Today, Nu chats with Davin Coburn, executive producer of audio for McClatchy newspapers. Coburn worked with Charlotte Observer reporter Scott Fowler on Carruth, a narrative podcast about former NFL star Ray Carruth, his girlfriend Cherika Adams, who was shot 4 times by a hitman, and their unborn son, Chancellor Lee. The narrative podcast they produced won this year's EPPY Award for Best Podcast with more than 1 million unique visitors. And here's Nu with the story.
Congratulations to Charlotte Observer on the EPPY Award for this year's Best Podcast with 1 million unique visitors and over for the podcast titled Carruth. The 8-episode series begins on November 16, 1999, when Cherika Adams was shot 4 times in Charlotte, North Carolina. A hitman tried to murder Adams, their girlfriend NFL Ray Carruth, and their unborn son Chancellor Lee, but the hitman failed. Hosted by Charlotte Observer reporter Scott Fowler, who has covered the saga for 19 years, the podcast takes listeners on a journey on justice, forgiveness, and healing. Here with me is Davin Coburn, executive producer of audio with McClatchy, parent company of The Observer. Hi, Davin. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for such a real honor with the EPPY Award.
Yeah, congratulations again. First, tell me a little bit about your position and what you do.
Sure. So as the executive producer of audio here, I help our 30 newsrooms around the country build up smart speaker flash briefings and locally essential podcasts. And every once in a while, there's a story like Carruth that comes out of one of our newsrooms that we think really has national appeal. And so when we find one of those stories, my department gets involved in producing it and helping sort of amplify it.
Okay. So how did you get personally involved with Caruth? It sounds like Scott's been covering it for a long time. So, how did you guys get involved from the McClatchy side?
Of course. So I've been a fan of Scott's work for a long time. He has covered this story, as you said, for 19 years. And I think it's one of those things that this company does very well, because we couldn't have told this story without the relationships that he has built there and without sort of the roots that he has in that community. There's a videographer who is part of this project named Jeff Seiner. And Jeff has also covered this story for almost as long. And we knew in advance that Caruth was scheduled to be released from prison last October. So this is one of those rare occasions in the news business where you can actually plan ahead. And so they knew that they were going to do a print series and presumably a video series as well. And so with my department here at the company now, the question was whether or not we could harness audio and do something with that too.
And before all this, does Scott have any, experience with podcasting, or is there some kind of training involved with getting them on board with their podcasting and their audio? And what was that like?
Oh, it was a real training experience for all of us. I'll admit that this is the first narrative show that McClatchy had ever attempted.
Wow.
In that larger kind of infrastructural level, we had to build the workflows just to be able to do this. And actually, there was another member of the team, Rachel Wise, there in Charlotte, who was tremendously valuable in figuring out how to field produce the interviews, figuring out where we could record Scott's narration, figuring out how we could then send things along to Washington, D.C., where I'm based, so that I could then edit things and I could distribute things from here. So as a company, we had to learn a lot. And so I think it was a very rewarding experience. And it's funny, Scott likes to joke that after all of this time, he's figured out how photographers and videographers like to tell a story. And so this was his first real attempt at figuring out how audio folks like to tell the same sort of story.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's a big difference too, besides, Scott's experience with print versus doing a podcast with audio, and what's that like, and the visuals and the word telling. So storytelling probably took a different approach with this podcast, correct?
Yeah, it absolutely did. And the way the workflow actually unfolded was that for about a year, Scott and largely Jeff Seiner interviewed 24 different people, and they recorded those largely for video. And then we were able to repurpose that audio from those interviews to be used in the podcast. Okay. Scott would then write the drafts of his stories for the series, and I would convert those into scripts. And then he would sort of go through and fact check it and make sure everything worked. And then he sat in a conference room, because Charlotte doesn't have a recording studio. He sat in a conference room with Rachel there, and we would spend hours on Hangout. I was, checking into the recording sessions just like this, and we would go through the whole thing. And they would send the audio back here to me, and then I would edit things on this end, and we'd go through sort of approvals and edits and back and forth that way. So we really did have to lay a lot of groundwork here, and we felt pretty good about what we came up with.
Was it kind of like you took the copy and then you transcribed it? Is that how it was? And then you basically wrote a script from the copy that Scott wrote? Is that
That's pretty much it, right? He would write a draft of his big text stories, and while those were being edited for print down there, I would take those as a solid working draft. He was the expert in this story, of course. He knows this better than anybody, and so I wasn't going to second guess him on what he was writing or how he wanted to go about telling the story. I would simply sort of rework it and insert audio elements and natural sound and really kind of bring it to life in a different way.
Got it. Okay. I'm sure was that a lot of copy for you to transcribe and read through?
It was something like 150 pages of script when all was said and done. It was. Yeah,
because that's eight episodes, right? And they were all about 40 minutes each or so. And that's a lot of words.
it was a lot of words, and thank goodness that I was having his drafts to work off of. And there was some back and forth on how we wanted to approach certain topics and how we wanted to say certain things. But at the end of it, we all felt pretty good about having a strong product here.
Okay. So tell me about how you guys broke it up as when you have each section has a different part of it. So was that part of your team kind of putting it together, and how you're going to break up the different podcasts in different categories? What was that like, breaking it up into different sections?
Sure. Well, it was interesting because each of the different storytellers in our different mediums approach the story slightly differently. So in text, for instance, Scott was able to go into a lot of kind of granular detail and really describe scenes in a way that might not have converted as well into a spoken script. Jeff Seiner, as the videographer, was able to harness really just the powerful visuals of Chancellor Lee, who has cerebral palsy and has been going through physical therapy sessions for years. And there is no way to describe in words what it is like to watch him go through one of those therapy sessions.
See visually, right? See a photo.
You have to see. Yeah. And then in my lane, what was cool is that there were elements that really translated well to audio. For instance, one of the biggest pieces of the story is Sharika Adams' 911 call the night that she was attacked. It is tremendously hard to listen to, but it is also incredibly moving. And the determination and the strength that she has just rings through.
And so it's like you said, something you want to be able to capture in a written story. You had to hear it, listen to it, right?
That's it. And as Scott has been talking with Sharika's mother, Sandra, over the years, what became very clear was not only the power of her words, but the power of her delivery. She is such an amazing speaker and an amazing storyteller that it occurred to all of us, people don't just want to read this, they're going to want to hear it. We should just give her the chance to talk about this story the way she does naturally, because it's far better than whatever we're going to come up with. And so the podcast really let us do that as well.
Okay. So talk about, how about the access, like having Chandra do a talk on audio and video. And you also spoke with the hitman too, that was, in jail and everything. So what was that like, the access of getting these two individuals and having them open up to you guys?
Of course, and that's a real credit to Scott's reporting. That it's interesting. That is just the standard kind of bootstraps reporting, I think, in a lot of ways that every reporter everywhere kind of can appreciate. He spent months and months trying to organize that interview with the hitman in prison, and eventually the authorities okayed it. But they wouldn't let him bring in any video cameras. They wouldn't let him bring in any major recording equipment. So as we talk about in the podcast, he had to record on one of those kind of flimsy little cheap kind of audio recorders.
Wow.
And he's sitting there across from, this murderer through two panes of bulletproof glass with a little grate at the bottom and trying to record the audio so that we could use it in the podcast. With Sandra, we spent, I don't even know how many different recording sessions with her, hours and hours total, and Chancellor Lee also, at her daughter's graveside. We went to some of these physical therapy sessions. It was sort of that access, as you mentioned, was born from the relationship that Scott had formed with this family over these 19 years. And I think that's just another one of the reasons that we probably couldn't have done this story without those relationships.
So let's talk about the kind of response that you guys received. I know a lot of it, listening to podcasts too, there's you had domestic violence, working with these nonprofits. We also have the 20-year anniversary coming out with Sharika's death. So what has it been like over the years of, getting feedback from either your community, from the family, from your readers? What's that been like?
The response has been overwhelming. And it is primarily, and rightly so, focused on what an inspirational family the Adamses are. All of the credit is due to them for sure. And I think on our side, as you mentioned, those nonprofit partners, one of the really rewarding aspects was partnering with domestic violence advocacy organizations and children's welfare organizations, because Caruth's story had been told before, but it had mostly been done through the athlete gone bad kind of a lens. And Sandra Adams has always talked about her daughter's legacy in terms of domestic violence advocacy. And it just so happened that Caruth was being released in October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And it made for a perfect opportunity for us to connect with some of those organizations and to elevate really good causes. It's a thing that actually McClatchy has been doing more of lately. We did a big video project recently about veterans and PTSD and medical issues. And there's a real feeling here that when we do work that's going to get a lot of attention, if we can help sort of shed some light on organizations that are helping make real tangible differences in these places, we should be able to do that.
That's great. Okay. So how did this podcast elevate the storytelling? We kind of talked about it a little bit, but looking back at your whole experience and journey, how did it, challenge you guys to, approach storytelling a different way? How was that like?
I think it was wonderful. And just what you said about approaching it a different way, primarily it demonstrates that this is another really powerful tool this company can use to engage new audiences with nonfiction storytelling, right? We've been doing it in text for 160 years. We've been doing video for a little bit more. And now we have this new tool in our toolbox. So I think that's a great thing. And in terms of kind of on a more granular level, what we did with the audio, it was a wonderful training experience for Scott and the rest of the team, and trying to sort of leverage the different talents and the different attributes of a story to just reach new audiences.
So looking back now, so what kind of podcast and audio tips would you give to other newspapers who are thinking about experimenting with this kind of storytelling?
Record everything. That's the first one. Just record it. Just turn the
good, the bad, the ugly,
that's
like
it.
everything.
When you're driving, when you are turning off the ignition, just record everything.
You never know what you're going to use, right?
That's it, exactly. And we used a lot of things in advance, traffic going by, a lot of things that no one would have necessarily said, yeah, that's a really key element of this story.
That's
and
so
so
we, podcast, yeah.
Absolutely. So that was one. I think a second one was to be sort of creative in your workflows, obviously, that we had to do, and that I know a lot of newsrooms have to do. It's the case whenever you are instituting new mediums, new technologies into legacy print organizations. It's trying to figure out how you harness the resources you already have, and you can do different things with the stuff that you're already collecting. And so I think the way that we collaborated with the video department here was a good example of us doing that. And I think sort of editorially, what we've found is that character-driven narratives really have a great chance to transcend geographic boundaries. I think everyone would acknowledge that this particular story has relatively little to do with Charlotte itself. The city is the setting for the story, but it isn't as much an integral character, if you will. And so when you have people like Sandra Adams, you have a story like Caruth and Sharika Adams and sort of their arc. People anywhere are able to be moved by that, and it doesn't have to be specifically in a given newsroom's traditional coverage area.
That's true, and I think having like podcast and audio will help you guys reach those people too, correct? Yeah, absolutely.
It's not only is it national, it's international. There are plenty of readers. And in fact, one of the very cool things was the number of listeners that we got from overseas. An interesting statistic is that of all of the hundreds of thousands of people who've downloaded this show, a relatively small percentage are from Charlotte, right? It was a real testament to the fact. Yeah, it was. It reached that core audience initially. We published it on the Charlotte Observer, so it was a great way to connect with that audience. But as word got out and as it picked up a little bit of visibility elsewhere, then readers in New York and California and Russia and the Middle East, were listening to the show as well. And all of a sudden, that geographic boundary just went away.
Did it surprise you guys, or did you guys really believe like maybe the story was strong enough that people in Russia would want to listen to it?
It surprised us how successful it was. I'll admit. We felt that we were sitting on a pretty grade A story here. We have known for a long time that stories about Caruth and about Sharika Adams' legacy have done very well, just in terms of sort of traffic, right? In terms of page views. And so we had faith that we were starting this narrative project with a good case study, with one that we thought, we think this can really be successful. But then again, sort of once it develops a life of its own, I don't think any of us really could plan for that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, congratulations again on all the success with Caruth and for your EPPY Award again. So where can people find Caruth and listen to it?
Find it anywhere they get their favorite shows, on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Stitcher and any place else. And if they have a chance to listen, we'd love to hear what they think.
Okay. Well, thanks, Davin, for joining us, and find out where you can find Caruth on any of your Spotify listeners. Thanks.
Thank you.
That wraps up this week's edition of E&P Reports, the official podcast of Editor and Publisher Magazine. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you enjoy your favorite podcasts. And if you'd like to rate and review the show, we'd sure appreciate that too. Well, this is your host, Bob Andelman, saying thanks for watching, thanks for listening. And please consider checking out my other podcast, Mr. Media Interviews, now in its 13th year at mrmedia.com. That's mrmedia.com. Let's talk, edit, and publish again next week.
This is E&P Audio, a service of Editor and Publisher Magazine. Since 1884, the authoritative voice of news publishing.